Good evening. We will go through første Kongebok kapittel 18, vers 21, nei, 41 to 46. I'm not going through 21 to 46. Anyway, 1 Kings 18, 41 through 46. We've just seen that God has burned up the offering. He has answered Elijah's single prayer after hours upon hours with the false prophets, cutting themselves and praying and dancing and all that they were doing, and Baal said nothing. Elijah prays once. God burns up the offering. Israel falls on their faces, and declares that the Lord is God. And then the verse just before this, we saw that Elijah has slaughtered the false prophets. And now he says to Ahab in verse 41, "Go up, eat and drink, for there is a sound of the rushing of rain." Now we haven't seen Ahab since verse 20, when he sent to all the people of Israel and gathered the prophets at Mount Carmel. Since then, like Rembrandt again, he's been in the background. He's been in the shadow. We've forgotten about him. In fact, I didn't even think much about it until reading this and studying it, and someone noted, we haven't seen Ahab since verse 20. I thought, oh yeah, he's just been missing. He's been gone. Standing in the background, which is probably what he does most of the time. He doesn't answer. He answers to everyone else. Whoever is the strongest in the room, it seems that Ahab prefers that person, and he can hide behind them. So he's been in the background, and Elijah tells him to go up, presumably further up the mountain, to eat and drink. Eat and drink what? Hasn't there been a famine? What is he eating and drinking? But a number of commentators think that this was a covenant renewal ceremony. So they would have, I don't know who would have been in this sort of ceremony, if it would have partly been Elijah and Ahab, and if there were other people, maybe others who repented, or it's at least King Ahab, because he is the king who represents God to the people and represents the people to God. We see something like this when the Mosaic covenant was made in Exodus, Andre Mosebok, kapittel 24, vers 9-11. Then Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel went up, and they saw the God of Israel. There was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. And he did not lay his hand on the chief men of the people of Israel. They beheld God and ate and drank. So this covenant has been made with Israel, what we, at least in English, call the Mosaic covenant, but it was a covenant with Israel. And the chief people went up and ate and drank together in God's presence. Now it is Ahab's turn as the king, the chief representative of the northern kingdom, to go up and eat and drink. Like I've already said, he, as the king, represents Israel to God in this ritual meal, celebrating that the covenant is and has been renewed. People have repented, it seems, saying the Lord, Yahweh, is God, not Baal, the Lord. And it appears that Ahab agrees. Every command that Elijah has given to Ahab, even before the competition, Ahab still obeyed it, but he's still obeying now. In verse 42, we see that Ahab listens, and he goes up the mountain. But why does Elijah say that he must do this? He says, "For there is a sound of the rushing of rain." This word for rushing occurs in other places in the Old Testament, where it describes either the thundering of many people, or of turbulent waves, or the rumbling of numerous chariots. So it is a monstrous sound. In verses 26 and 29, when the false prophets, were doing their dancing and all their whole gig, we read that there was no voice. No one answered. Baal did not speak. He could not speak. He did nothing. He was in the bathroom. But now there is a noise. And this is no light shower, but a downpour. God is going to pour out his covenant blessings on a dry land. So in verse 42, Ahab went up to eat and to drink, and Elijah went up to the top of Mount Carmel. And he bowed himself down on the earth and put his face between his knees. And he said to his servant, "Go up now, look toward the sea." And he went up and looked and said, "There is nothing." And he said, "Go again 7 times." Elijah said, "There is a sound of rushing rain." But here his servant sees nothing over the waters. I think there are 2 options here. It could be that Elijah heard the rain, there just is no cloud yet. It's so loud, but it's still far away. It's like when you see lightning, you count however many seconds, and you know it's that many miles or kilometers away when you hear the thunder. It could be something similar, that I hear this noise, but it's still very far away. It could also be, on the other hand, that Elijah is so sure God will keep his promise that he actually speaks before he hears anything. I don't know. I wasn't there. Either way, because we know in verse 1 of this chapter, God told Elijah, rain is coming. Elijah tells Ahab, rain is coming. You need to eat. His point is that God keeps his promises. The rain will come, and it will come heavy. So Elijah tells his servant to look toward the sea. The edge of the top of Mount Carmel looks out toward the Mediterranean Sea. I mentioned that in my last session. Rain often came in from the sea, which was, okay, I don't know if my video is going to be flipped around or how this works, but this is going to be right. It comes in from the west, and then it moves over to Israel in the east. If that's wrong, forgive me. But this would have been another put down to the Canaanite gods. The Hebrew word for water is Yam, E-A-M. The Canaanite god of the sea is Yam, E-A-M-M. The Canaanite gods haven't been able to produce rain for 3 years. And now God is bringing the rain, and he's bringing it in from the sea to show that it is his might, it is his power that this rain comes, and it is by his faithfulness to his people that he has promised in the land that he has given them. But even though God gave that promise in verse 1 that there will be rain, even though God has shown himself faithful all throughout Scripture, the servant said, "There's nothing." So Elijah sits down and starts crying. "God, what is this for? Why am I here? And you promised me." No, Elijah begins praying again. Now, I don't know what I would have done. Maybe, I hope, having had a promise like that, I would have prayed again. Knowing me and my personality, I probably would have, we can wait. God said he's going to do it. Let's just sit here and wait. We don't need to do anything. It'll come. Elijah prays again. He prayed once in verses 36 to 37 that God would answer him, and God answered immediately. Why doesn't God answer him immediately now? Why pray 7 times? Why pray at all? Elijah showed himself to Ahab. That's what God said in verse 1. Show yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain. Elijah showed himself to Ahab. Still no rain. There was a contest. Still no rain. God won. God was proven to be the one and true God with real power. Still, no rain. How did Elijah know to pray? And to pray 7 times? Well, when he prayed over the widow's son, he prayed 3 times. How many times was he going to pray until that boy came back? Did he know just 3? Would he have stopped at 7? I mean, we aren't given this information. Elijah had a relationship with God. We don't know the conversations, most of the conversations they had. We don't know what he knew. But what he did know is that God gave a promise in verse 1, and Elijah was going to pray. He didn't sit and wait or complain. He prayed because God said he would send rain. We see an example of this in Daniel chapter 9 in the first 4 verses. Daniel knew the prophecy that God gave Jeremiah about the 70 years of exile in Babylon. So what does he do? Does he flip his calendar and say, all right, time's almost up. It's coming. He prays. He confesses Israel's sin and prayed that God would keep his promise and fulfill his word. Okay, God, we're getting close to the end. Keep your promise, please. You know what you've told us. Please fulfill your word. Don't forget us. Now, throughout this chapter, both chapters, 17 and 18, Elijah has been giving orders to other people, but now he humbles himself before the Lord. Is he a super prophet? I grew up thinking of Elijah as this amazing man, which he and Elisha did a lot of miracles. He has an important role in the Bible, in the Old Testament, in both. But in the intertestamental books, so those are books written between the Old and the New Testament, that would be the Apocrypha, Pseudepigrapha, and some other books. When Elijah's talked about, sometimes, maybe often, he's pictured almost as godlike. Like, here's God, and he's up here. He might as well be an archangel. I mean, he's amazing. Or is he, like James writes, just a normal, faithful Israelite? I guess that wasn't so normal in this time, but is he a normal person, a faithful Israelite, who, having a nature just like we do, is very acutely aware of his needs and his limitations and what he can't do? Elijah knows he's not a magician. He can't throw some water and say, well, it's raining. He has no tricks to get out of tight spots. He didn't set fire to the offering. He can't make it rain. And his only option is to pray. He also knows that while, yes, if no rain comes, he might look foolish to everyone. But if God has said rain will come and then no rain comes, how does that look for God? Jesus taught us to pray, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Yahweh willed for rain. He told Elijah it would rain. And it did through Elijah's consistent prayer. Well, for us, we aren't robots. We know this. Even with Calvinism, we still believe we have the ability to choose between, I'm drinking coffee right now, it's evening over there. It doesn't really matter. If you're a parent, you know you're tired. But we make choices. We know God works with us. We know that God moves upon our lives, but that he works with our personalities and with the way we are. He doesn't force us to do things. God honors us as his servants who can pray for his will to be done. So I have a few verses here. Ezekiel 36, verses 37 through 38. The Lord says, this also I will let the house of Israel ask me to do for them, to increase their men like a flock. Like the flock for sacrifices, like the flock at Jerusalem during her appointed feasts, so shall the waste places be filled with flocks of men. So there's going to be a population boom, explosion. It will grow. But Yahweh says, let the house of Israel ask me to do this. In Revelation 22, verse 20, Jesus promises, yes, I am coming soon. And right after that, we, his people, respond, amen. Come, Lord Jesus. In Isaiah 11, chapter 11, verse 9, the earth shall be full of the knowledge of Yahweh, or of the Lord, as the waters cover the seas. Yet, in Matthew 6, verse 10, we are told by Jesus to pray, thy kingdom come. There seems to be this both and. It's not either or. God said it's going to happen, so we just sit and wait. We are also told to pray. Sorry, I have 2 kids outside. 1 is sleeping, 2 are outside. I have to make sure no one's crying. I think it's okay. Yeah, for me personally, I mean, I'm not someone who talks a lot. I enjoy writing, so these tend to be longer. Talking on the spot, I don't have very much to say. So prayer has always been difficult for me too. Okay, I said what needs to be said. What else is there? Okay, I'm done. I really enjoy listening to my wife pray because she can get really into the specifics of our kids or a situation that's going on, and I always appreciate her perspective on that because her just what she brings in the prayer is always really nice for me to hear, and it's something I need to grow in. I have a quote from someone: "There is a mystery at the heart of prayer. God's promises are unbreakable, yet He encourages us to pray for their fulfillment, and thus gives us the amazing privilege of having a little part in the outworking of His purposes." In verse 44, "And at the 7th time the servant said, Behold, a great..." No, actually, "Behold, a little cloud, like a man's hand, is rising from the sea." And yet, that little cloud was enough to satisfy Elijah. And Elijah said, "Go up, say to Ahab, prepare your chariot and go down, lest the rain stop you." In chapter 17, verses 13 and 14, Elijah told the widow to make a little cake. So she would first do something small, but it would require great trust. And then something great after that would come. But the flour and the oil wouldn't stop until the rain came. Now there was a little cloud, and it takes faith. Elijah could say, is that actually the cloud? I mean, it's so small. Ahab could say, "You want me to go home with that little thing rising up?" But there's this little cloud, and the rain is going to pour down. So much so that if Ahab didn't begin now, he wouldn't make it home. In verse 45, which probably wouldn't have been a bad thing, but in verse 45, "And in a little while the heavens grew black with clouds and wind, and there was a great rain. And Ahab rode and went to Jezreel." Now in English it says, "and in a little while the heavens grew black." The Hebrew word there, or phrase, is translated almost everywhere else in Kings as "thus." "Thus the heavens grew black, and there was a great rain." I don't know I don't have the Norwegian text up right now. I guess it would just be the idea of, as you're talking and you say, "Oso, oso son," and then this happened, and then this happened. It's just, and then this happened. He says, "Go home before this starts," and then suddenly that little cloud grew big. There were black clouds, wind, and a great rain. So Ahab rode home and went to Jezreel. Ahab obeys so quickly, we aren't even told he went down the mountain. It doesn't say Ahab went down, got in his chariot, rode home to Jezreel, or rode to his summer palace in Jezreel. It just says he's up on the mountain. He rode. He simply rode and went to Jezreel, or Yisrael. So now we know what happens in the next chapter, but reading this, we can ask, should we be hopeful? Should we, if we had heard this story, If this was the first time we had heard this story, we might be hopeful. Now, there's an up and down movement that, I think, pictures a restoration of life. In chapter 17, Elijah carried the dead boy up into the upper chamber. In verse 19, after the boy receives his life, Elijah carries the living boy back down into the house. Israel has repented, the Lord is God, and Ahab seems to be on the same side. He obeys Elijah. He has gone up the mountain, eaten his covenant meal, and now he has gone back down to ride to Jezreel, where he will tell Jezebel about all that has happened. Should we expect the spiritual life of both Ahab and Israel to be restored? It might be seeing too much into a few up and down movements. He went up and down, he went up and down. But there is a small focus on up and down movements in 2 Kings chapter 1 and 2 as well. I don't know if anyone picks up on that. It doesn't really matter that much. It's just that the author does make note of some of these things. And this is fairly common in Hebrew literature, where sometimes even very small details in the narrative or in the story can carry important meaning. They don't change the meaning of a whole text, but they can still carry important meaning. A dead Gentile boy received his life. Will Israel and its king receive their lives too? Will they really turn back to God? Or will they remain hardened against God and dead towards him? Now, for those exiles sitting in Babylon, they know the story, they know the history, they know what's happened. But it's worth asking, what would they think? What would they have thought when they heard or read this story, heard it being taught while they sat in exile in Babylon? Ahab is right there. And again, Solomon's prayer in chapter 8, I read it last time. God, in verse 38, God gives rain when even one man prays. In verse 39, then hear in heaven your dwelling place, and forgive and act and render to each whose heart you know, according to all his ways. For you only, know the hearts of all the children of mankind, that they may fear you all the days that they live in the land that you gave to our fathers. So, Elijah has prayed. Rain is coming. We saw that Obadiah feared God. What are Ahab's ways? Now, up to now, we've seen his ways. In chapter 16, verse 25, his father Omri did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, more evil than all who were before him. And then after he dies and Ahab becomes king, he did evil in the sight of the Lord, more than all who were before him. In verse 33, Ahab did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him. So we could be hopeful here. But we also have to ask, like Jeremiah wrote, can a leopard change his spots? Then at the end of chapter 22, 1 Kings 22, it says, Ahaziah, the son of Ahab, so Ahab's son, did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and walked in the way of his father, and in the way of his mother, and in the way of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. He served Baal, and worshipped him, and provoked the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger in every way that his father had done. Now, we can't save our kids, we can't change their hearts, but we can give them the best examples we can, so that hopefully they walk in our ways. We hope that they walk better than we ever did. But as the king who represented God to the people, Ahab failed miserably. So right here in the story, I'll just be a moment. So I'm actually surprised that it took so long before they came up. I was able to get through almost all of my verses. Whole 5 verses. Okay, but here's the last one. Right there in the story, there is some hope. But both we and the exiles who first heard this story, we know what happens next. In verse 46, and the hand of the Lord was on Elijah. And he gathered up his garment and ran before Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel. Here, King Ahab is given a chance to respond to the word of Yahweh and to reject Baal. Now, the distance from Mount Carmel to Yisrael or Jezreel was 27 kilometers, which is roughly from Oslo to Asker. That's far for Elijah to run, but the hand of the Lord was on him so that he could run ahead of Ahab. But this distance also gave Ahab time to think and process all that had just happened. Everything he had just witnessed Elijah do. Baal failed. Baal is nothing, is no God. The real God, the Lord, Yahweh, who is our Father, is the real God. He has done everything that they needed, and now he is giving them rain that they can live. Elijah runs ahead of the chariot, which is a picture that the king must be subject. So, must be subject to the word of the prophets. We have the prophet. I often think of the king as being on top, but the king has to answer to God's prophet. If you think of King David and the situation with Bathsheba, and then how he had Uriah killed in battle, Nathan the prophet comes to David, gives him a parable about a man stealing a sheep. And David gets angry over it and says, that man must die. And Nathan roars at David and says, he is the man of the story. You are the man. Now, David's the king. He didn't have to like or agree with Nathan. He could have pointed over to one of his guards, over to Nathan, to kill him. He could have done like Saul, threw the spear himself at Nathan. He could declare Nathan to be a false prophet, and Nathan knew that. But David also knew that he himself was subject to God's judgment. He knew that he as king over Israel was under the prophet's word. So if the prophet brought a word from the Lord, David knew he had better listen. Now we see in the beginning of 1 Kings a wannabe king, someone who wants to be the king. He has people run before him. In chapter 1, verse 5, now Adonijah, the son of Haggith, exalted himself, saying, I will be king. And he prepared for himself chariots and horsemen, and 50 men to run before him. Elijah the prophet is the forerunner to King Ahab. Isaiah and Malachi in chapter 3 and in chapter 4, foretell about someone, Elijah, who will come before the Lord, the King, and make his path straight. Luke chapter 1, verse 17 tells us John the Baptist will go in the spirit and power of Elijah. And in Matthew 11, verse 14, Jesus tells the crowd, tells all the people, that John the Baptist was Elijah who is to come. This Elijah, who we're studying now, not John the Baptist, under the power of Yahweh, was playing the role of prophetic herald, possibly proclaiming the changed attitude of Ahab and his loyalty to Yahweh. The Lord's power brings blessing, success, and victory. In Hittite text, those were people who lived north of Israel. It was the gods who ran before the chariot of the king. Here, Elijah runs as God's representative, running before the king of God's people. The king might actually have had a change of heart. Now all he needs to do is convince his pagan wife. How hard can that be? Now that question gets answered tomorrow by Daniel. But for now, at the end of this chapter, things appear good. They appear promising. Elijah has won. A covenant meal has taken place. Covenant is renewed again. They are no longer idolaters and covenant breakers. God is blessing his people with much needed rain again. He blessed them. Not only is he blessing them, but he blesses them through the prayers of just one person, who has a nature just like us. Now I'll give more after this, and I'll give questions on WhatsApp that you can break up in your discussion groups and answer. Okay, thank you.